Thanks for coming back to us and listening to us here on our Colorado Victim Advocate podcast. It's a weekly podcast, hopefully, and we are Intervention Inc. We are sitting in the high rise of Lakewood, Colorado. Not really. There's only 4 or 5 stories to this building, but I like to think that I'm in some really big, tall building, but that's okay. Today, we have a really special guest with us. Chelsea is a victims advocate at a prosecution-based organization, and we're just going to be talking about some of the issues that she has dealt with regards to those folks that she comes in contact with. And it's important to understand, too, that victims advocates that are at the prosecution level of the criminal justice system, their work is remarkably different than that of those folks who are law enforcement-based advocates, the folks that go out in the middle of the night, that kind of thing, or with probation or parole level, those folks that, usually deal with victims, on a basis in which, their case has been adjudicated for quite some time. And so she's going to be talking just about the work that she does, not only there at a prosecution level, but also to just some of her history that she's worked in the criminal justice system. So we're very happy to have Chelsea here today. So Chelsea, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Chelsea, a lot of times too, when people hear about prosecution, district attorney, victims advocacy, just kind of give us an idea, if you can, certainly, about just the work that you do there. And, we'll go into a little bit more about it.
Sure. So under the Victims' Rights Act of Colorado, victims are asserted certain rights in terms of the criminal justice process. Namely, the big thing about the criminal justice process is it's confusing. It's confusing to a lot of people, and especially when you're going through a huge trauma being a victim of a violent crime. So the Victims' Rights Act assures that victims have the right to be heard. They have a right to be kept up to date on what's called critical stage events in the criminal process, which we can talk about further into the episode. And they have a victim advocate who is there to support and guide them along the way. And those are a general overview of my duties. They obviously go a little bit deeper than that, but that is the gist of a victim advocate at the prosecution level.
And a lot of times too, that's when the cases are actually going on in a courtroom setting. And so, we can certainly talk about that too, but just kind of give us an idea as to some of those phases, some of those critical stage events where you are actually in contact with victims, and we'll go from there.
Of course. So a critical stage event is essentially important points in the criminal justice process whenever a offender or defendant, in this case, goes through. So in the Victims' Rights Act, critical stage events are things like when are they going to be due next in court? Are they going to be offered a plea deal? If so, what is that plea deal going to be? What is the sentencing structure for this particular crime look like? Victims also have the right to be present at these hearings, and in many cases, they also have the right to be heard by the court, in other words, the judge themselves. So, for example, a sentencing hearing is one of the most common situations that a critical stage event where a victim would appear and be heard. They would talk about how the crime affected them, what they want to see happen as a result of the sentencing, and then the court takes their opinion into consideration whenever they make the final sentence. So that's just an example of what a victim has the right to be kept up to date about, and also has the right to show up and give an opinion.
So when you see a lot of those folks show up there in court, and obviously court can be a very scary place,
absolutely,
for everybody. When a victim shows up there at court, where do you meet them at? Or, what is your process when you come in contact with them? Because perhaps it's different at other district attorneys' offices. So if you could just talk about that.
I try and do an introduction over the phone with a victim before a hearing so that they know who their contact is, but also to get an idea of their comfort level in terms of how they want to be notified and whether or not they feel comfortable coming to court. In those conversations, we often talk about whether they would like to meet me in the courtroom, which is probably the most common way of doing it. They will just come in, sit down, and I will come and say hi and talk to them, maybe talk to them outside the courtroom for privacy. However, sometimes victims, you're right, it can be very intimidating. So sometimes they don't know what they're doing or they're scared. So in that case, I might meet them outside the courtroom, sometimes even outside the courthouse, to walk them actually physically into the building. That way they don't feel so alone, and they know that they have someone there to support them.
So in those instances in which, they are in court and their defendant is there, what have you seen in regards, or what do you tell the victim when they're going to be in that type of situation? Because maybe they may have not had any contact with the defendant at that point. I mean, kind of talk about that with regards to what a victim might be having to deal with at that moment.
Sure. A very common question. And I try and have that conversation ahead of time as well. Defendants are almost always going to be in the courtroom at a hearing. And even that almost is dependent. Like, if they don't show up, they have consequences they have to face. So I would say 99% of the time, the defendant will be there in the courtroom. And it's important for a victim to know that and to expect it. In that case, I try and give them a layout of the courtroom so they know where the defendant might be. I try and make sure that they know what security measures we have in place, and also reassure them that I will be there. So I rarely have an issue where a defendant tries to speak to or intimidate a victim, but on the chance that it happens, usually just stepping in, lightly intervening and directing the defendant back to his or her attorney and walking the victim out of the courtroom is usually enough. In most extreme cases, we have sheriffs in the courthouse who can come and be there as an extra additional support. But again, it's very rare for those interactions to happen, but it doesn't mean that a victim's not scared of it happening.
Do some of those defendants, do they come in when they're still in custody?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's another conversation that we try and have is, are they still in custody or are they released? And most of the time the victim is made aware. There are systems in place that help them keep track of whether or not their defendant is in custody or not. But especially when a defendant is in custody, that's when I'm able to tell them, this is the door they're going to be coming through. The sheriff will be here to make sure that they do not have any sort of contact with you, verbal or otherwise. And then when they're outside of custody, that's when we go over the other safety protocols that I discussed.
And so, what do you, when you're sitting there with the victim, or if you are sitting there with a victim and their offender, it comes into the courtroom and they're in custody and, they're wearing, a jail jumper or something like that. I mean, what's kind of going through the victim's mind? Are they talking to you about that at that moment or anything?
Not necessarily. A lot of them pretty much just sit there quietly and watch. Though on occasion, you do see a lot of body language and nonverbals that come from them. Big sighs are a big one. Wringing of hands, picking at nails, nervous habits, nervous tics. And even though this person is in custody, like you said earlier, for a lot of them, it's the first time that they've seen this defendant since the offense, or at least in a very long time, depending on when the last hearing was. So it can be really rattling to see them. And my experience is it's natural for a defendant who is being walked out into the courtroom in that situation to also scan the courtroom, usually to look for their own supports, but it can be really intimidating when they lock eyes with a victim. And so oftentimes that can kind of jack up the nerves too.
I remember for myself being a very young victims advocate in Adams County at the DA's office back then. And of course, we were in the old courthouse, that was built, I think, in the 1950s, and, and it had lime green walls. And I just remember they used to bring the inmates over in the bus, and there wasn't any type of security like they have now as far as like how they bring them into the courtrooms. And I just remember, as I like to say, back in the bad old days, they would bring in all the inmates in at once. They'd be like on a chain gang. They would walk them right through the middle of the courthouse, and of course, you'd see their family members trying to reach out to them, and the jail deputies, telling them, you need to stay away from them and all that. Yeah. And so, when you see those folks, in the work that you do, and the inmates come in like that, I mean, what have you seen with the with the inmates, what are they doing other than, like scanning the courtroom? Are they just, sitting there, waiting for the hearing to be called up, or what?
So things are different in the courthouse where I work. They're held in a back room that's separate from the general public, and then they are brought one at a time.
One at a time.
By the sheriffs, yeah. So a lot of times they're brought in right as their case is being called. At most, maybe they're called in two at a time and one sits at the table while one is being called. But again, that doesn't really happen too often. So it's really quick. And it also makes it difficult to give a timeline of when to expect to see the defendant be brought out and when the case is going to be called to the victim. So oftentimes, unfortunately, even though we're there for what could potentially be literally a 30-second hearing, the victim could unfortunately be sitting there for 2 hours because we're waiting for people to be brought from the jail and walked into the courtroom.
So, like I said, and sometimes, again, back in the bad old days, you'd have, events happen. Have you ever seen anything like that, where, an inmate, gets rattled, physically upset or anything like that. And, when I would be sitting there with the victim, that obviously scares them even more because, they're unfamiliar with what's going on. And I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that we always have with victims. How do you try to explain to them so they can understand with it? Because especially with like sexual assault victims, they're being flooded with information, too many different people, staff changes. I mean, how do you try to assure the victim that you're going to try to explain it to them, the process, so they can understand it as best they can?
Right. So first and foremost, it's important to reassure a victim that needing to hear things slower and sometimes repeated is a completely normal human thing when you're going through something like this. Mm-hmm. I have often told victims that even I haven't been in this field or something similar up to this field for the last 10 years. Even I need to have things re-explained to me, and I struggle with some concepts sometimes. And it's because it's a learning process. The criminal justice system is constantly evolving. The laws are consistently changing, hopefully for the better. And so validating the victim and letting them know, like, hey, no one expects you to suddenly pick up a law degree overnight is really, really important. So,
well, what do you see as one of the hardest things for victims to understand about the prosecution phase of the criminal justice system? I mean, what have you seen? Because I'm sure you've seen everything from, first advisal hearings all the way to trial hearings, sentencing hearings. I mean, what's the one concept or what's the one part of that victims just really struggle with? Because, they're put into a maelstrom that they just don't understand. They don't have any power and control.
Right.
And, what do you see as one of the most common themes that you have to deal with?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say probably timeline of how long it takes a case to resolve. I think the media gives this idea to the public that, someone's arrested, they're immediately brought to the courthouse, and then in 2 weeks' time, we're in trial, and then it's over, and we have a sentence, and we can move on with our day. And that is not the case, especially in felony cases. And I have worked both misdemeanor and felony cases, misdemeanors being lower level offenses, felonies being the more serious offenses. And so it's really important to have conversations with victims right up front and let them know, especially in really horrible cases like unfortunately homicides or sexual assaults, that these cases could take potentially years to resolve. That's not always the case, but it is a possibility. And there are many different reasons why this happens, but it can be really daunting to a victim because their life was just turned upside down, and all they really want is to see things return as much as they can to normal. And it's not always clear at first how long they're going to be dealing with this. And that is emotionally, mentally so incredibly tough on them.
And a lot of times because you bring your experience that you've worked as an advocate to the work that you're doing right now. And you talked a little bit about that earlier, about your experiences. Can you tell us, what is, your experience working with victims in the system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a number of different jobs. I have worked as a victim advocate in a domestic violence shelter. So I have been an advocate in terms of kind of that first response when someone is initially going through the trauma itself. And sometimes they're not even fully ready to go to the police yet. So at that point, I was getting people who, were running away from their home in the middle of the night, or were being dropped off by police officers, having their lives upturned. So that's a big part of my history. I have also been in child protection, which is different from victim advocacy in many ways, but also sees a lot of the same things in terms of trauma, crisis intervention, and trying to help people understand the process and how trauma affects them. And I have also been a victim advocate on the probation side, which is post-conviction. And that is also a little bit different. Again, I think when people think that a case is sentenced, they're like, great, I can move on with my lives. But for a lot of people, especially in probation, you can be on probation for years. So at that point, they went through the criminal justice process for 1, maybe even 2 years, then they were sentenced, and now this person's on probation for 2 or 3 years, maybe even more. So when you think about it, that's 4 to 6 years of a person's life right there. So I have really been in an advocacy point, not necessarily victim advocacy, but an advocacy point at different stages in our criminal justice system.
And so when you have the folks, at the law enforcement level, victim advocacy, they probably have provided resources, referral information. But obviously, I recall for myself being a line victims advocate when I was at Commerce City PD, a lot of times, they're, or most of not all the times, they're not in that moment. They're traumatized. They've got a lot of questions,
right,
or they're trying to heal physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially, of course. And then they end up forgetting that information.
Right.
And that's just kind of part of advocacy, that we have to be there for them. But what are some of the referral information that you provide to victims at your level when they come in?
So I try and meet them where they're at, and everyone is a little bit different, and it honestly depends on the crime that was committed itself. But referrals could be mainly mental health referrals. I am a huge mental health advocate, a huge advocate for therapy for all different reasons. I think it should be a normal part of everyone's life, regardless of if you've been through a traumatic event or not, but that's neither here nor there in the purpose of this podcast. And so I try and work with the victims and assess, number one, what is their view of mental health in general, not just their mental health, but view in general, because cultural can be really big on that.
Yes.
Family dynamics can be really big on that. And so trying to talk with someone and immediately be like, you should go into therapy, doesn't usually work. You want to try and work with them and see where they're at in terms of self-care. What support systems do they have? Who and what do they trust in their community to bring them mental and emotional support? And then kind of go from there. And a lot of times you can work with that and talk about the benefits of therapy and what different kinds of therapy there are. For those of you who don't know, therapy is really wide range these days, which is absolutely fantastic. Obviously, we have talk therapy, but we also have art therapy and my personal favorite, animal-based therapy, which I could talk for hours on end.
Can we will at some point.
We will at some point. Randy's not going to let me today.
Of course, we will.
Yes. Let me tell you about the rats.
No, that's important. That's important because a lot of folks that we deal with, that they don't know all the different types of therapy that's available out there. You're right. You talked about that animal therapy, art therapy, music therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, with a lot of kids, tragically that have been traumatized, they can't express themselves verbally. And so, art therapy is a really big thing too. In addition to those pieces that you give to victims, what are some of the other referral information that might be available out there in the community?
Grief is a huge thing that I run into. And grief can come in many different forms. There's the obvious one, there is a death from a horrific accident or from a homicide, but also just grief for the life that you lost. In domestic violence, people, their entire lives are turned upside down. Their marriages are ended half the time. The family is broken apart. So there's grief for a life lost. But so I try and direct people also to support groups. That is still in the realm of therapy, but also it's mainly just introducing them to other people so that they know that they're not alone. Financial resources are also a huge one. I mean, people have massive medical bills. They have therapy bills, objects in their life that were broken, that were important to them, or lost that they need to replace. Maybe even housing help, things like that. So really, those are the top two, and I try and direct them to different resources based on their needs, because not every resource covers every need. So another role of a victim advocate is to be familiar with different programs, what the programs can and cannot do, and then help guide the victims in that process.
And speaking, and talking about that information that you do provide to your victims, I mean, the work that we do, we come in contact with so many different people who have, obviously been victimized. And while we're trying to provide that advocacy for them, a lot of times those folks that we deal with, because yes, we have a saying, tragically today's victim is tomorrow's offender and vice versa. Yeah. And we have those folks that we deal with that can be what we would use the word uncooperative. They don't want to have anything to do with the system. They show up anyways. I mean, how do you try to deal with somebody like that in the work that you do, especially at that level where their testimony, is really important to it, but for a variety of reasons, they just don't want to be cooperative with the system?
Sure. So I'm going to start that particular answer off with probably the most important thing you need to have as an advocate, and honestly, in my opinion, in the criminal justice system, in all caps, in bold lettering, empathy. And empathy is putting yourself in their shoes and understanding, if you were in their situation, how would you react? And understanding that people react in different ways. How I react to a situation may not be the same way that you react to a situation. And it's being flexible with those emotions and going with the flow. Now, I say that because sometimes when a victim is uncooperative, they're seen as difficult, or I've even heard the term crazy. And I don't feel that that is always fair. Because to ask someone to go through the criminal justice system willingly is a huge ask. Again, they've already been through a trauma, and now you're asking them to relive that trauma over and over and over again, to meet new people and to constantly have to face the person who hurt them in court, and potentially even have to get up in front of 6 to 12 jurors, not to mention whoever comes to watch a jury trial, and relive that trauma and tell the story right to the person who hurt them's face. So when dealing with an uncooperative victim, it's important to start off there. And again, meeting them where they're at. And when I talk to them, I make it clear that it's optional for them to work with me. They do not have to. But if they say no, it doesn't mean that I'm going away and it's like, okay, you lost your chance, that's it. I make it clear, hey, I respect your decision. I wish you nothing but the best. Here's my card. If you change your mind at any point, please reach out. Or if you need anything and then never want to talk to me again, that's okay too. And I have often found that using that approach, I might not hear from a victim for months and months and months, but then something hits them out of the blue and they're just like, I need someone to talk to. And now they have a number that they can reach out to. Now, I may not be able to help them with everything, but at least I'm a talking point to guide them and say, how about we try this person or this organization? It's just one person, one phone number to keep track of.
And I think that's probably where, a lot of folks, we end up, really trying to advocate for them. And an important piece that you talked about is being empathetic, is, meeting that person, where they are, understanding what they've gone through. And, some of the things that unfortunately some people do is they have a tendency to, give them, advice. And, we try to say in the advocacy world, we're not going to give you advice. Right. We're going to provide you with options and resources. Kind of, if you can talk about that too, with regards to, those victims that, you do come in contact with, perhaps, in the more, what we would classify as serious cases, but all cases in the system are serious. But if you could just talk a little bit about probably, what has been one of the most challenging pieces for you specifically, because a lot of times too, that's, we start taking on that trauma, and how do you gauge yourself? How do you help yourself deal with, that with regards to being resilient to it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to back that up a little bit to something that you said just a few seconds earlier, which is, you're right. We cannot give advice. We can only give options. And I think that's a huge misunderstanding in terms of a victim advocate is we are not lawyers. We don't hold that kind of power in a courtroom. We don't have decision-making power, things of that nature. And that can be really hard for a victim to understand because, like you said, they have a lot of times felt like they've lost that power and control. And so they turn to their victim advocate to try and return it to them. And it's usually not something that we can do, at least not right away. So when a victim realizes that, they go through the whole grief process that I talked about all over again. And it's, we have this beacon, we have this victim advocate, it's in the name, talk to the judge, you tell them to do this, or you tell the district attorney to do that, or you tell the defense attorney that, and it's simply not something that we can do. And the victim at that point kind of reaches a point where they're like, then what's the point in all this? Does anyone really actually care what I've gone through? And we do care, not just the victim advocates, but the district attorneys and even the judges. We do very much care. Just unfortunately, we're tied down by the law in a lot of things. And when a victim is sitting there holding your hand crying because they've lost a loved one, or because someone was found not guilty at trial of a horrific sexual assault or domestic violence or an aggravated robbery, you too feel helpless. Your whole job is to be there to support them and guide them and make them feel like there is actual justice in the criminal justice system. And it can be really disheartening to see someone go through all of that time, all of that pain, all of that retelling of their trauma to potentially come to an outcome that doesn't benefit them. And even in cases where we get a guilty verdict or someone pleads guilty, it doesn't magically fix someone's life, a death, doesn't bring back their loved one, things of that nature. So secondary trauma is a huge problem in victim advocacy and, dare I say, in the criminal justice system.
Because, there are programs, that we utilize, to try to deal with, the trauma resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of times too, that's just very hard because, like most victims advocates, you're dealing with just a wide range of cases, a wide range of crimes, a wide range of victims. And I think that's really an important piece too that you talked about is being able to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
In the work that you do. I'm often asked, you've been in this field for as long as you have. How are you able to, process what you've done? And, there's a whole different, ways to doing that. And I think that, as advocates coming into this field, that's something that people have to understand. And so in the work that you do, have you ever, been showing somebody, a new employee, how the work that they're going to be doing, but also too, just telling them about how to deal with some of these, because that is true. For myself, I've had, many a case, where the trial, the defendant was found not guilty.
Right.
And, that was very hard, like you said, on myself, on you as an advocate. But, for somebody new coming into this field, what would you be telling them?
So I'm going to repeat this advice that I've heard from many people, but for some reason it just rings so true from a dear friend and colleague of mine that I currently work with, which is you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to be able to fill your own cup first and take care of others before you take care of yourself before you take care of others. So when I'm working with a new advocate or even a new district attorney, self-care is one of the things that I drive home, probably ad nauseum. I am very annoying about self-care. Things like work-life balance is probably the most important, at least in my mind. So knowing when to turn off your phone, knowing when to turn off your laptop, knowing when you're at home and you're relaxing, watching TV or the news or listening to music, that you're filling your cup with things that are actually healing and not triggering for you. So for me personally, watching the news, especially in this day and age when I've had a tough day, is a bad idea because it doesn't fill my cup. Yeah. It just makes me feel even more sad and depressed about the state of the world. So I do other things. Having hobbies is important, having a support network, making sure that your family and friends understand the true extent of what your job is, and not just your roles and duties, but the information that you can't share because, this is confidential information. I can't go home to my family and say, Jane Doe went through this specific crime and here's the conversation detail for detail of what she told me, or John Doe experienced this injury and blah, blah, blah. We can't do that because we care very much and are legally obligated to protect the privacy of the victims that we work with. So for our families, it can be really hard for us to come home from a long day and you're not able to tell them explicitly why it was such a hard day.
And that's a really important piece too. When you really do the work that you do, the work that you enjoy doing. I mean, that's probably the biggest piece of it, is to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. What do you enjoy about the work that you do?
It is fulfilling. I have seen the criminal justice system, as I talked about earlier, from many sides, but that also includes from the civilian side. And I think the Victims' Rights Act is so important because I know from personal experience how incredibly alone you can feel when you're involved in the criminal justice system as a victim, and how overwhelming it can be when you don't know what's going on. So I take huge pride that I get to be part of the system that helps support victims in that way. Additionally, sometimes people just need someone to talk to, and it's nice to know that my victims trust me in that way, that they know they can call me and say, Chelsea, I'm having a hard time today, and I just need someone to vent to for a second. I have a rule with my victims, which is you can yell to me, just not at me. We're always respectful, but if you need to raise your voice and scream for a second at the ether, that's totally fine, because that's a normal human emotion.
And, I think that too, with regards to, dealing with those folks, because they're all so different, that they're all very different.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, the one piece that's always the same with all the victims that we deal with is that they've been traumatized, that they don't have any power and control. And if it was a domestic violence case, that was already happening in their life.
Right.
And now they're going to be put into a process where they even have less power and control. How do you provide that type of, I don't know if you want to call it reassurance, to the victim who you've never met before, and now they're being asked to talk about some of those personal things in their life? I mean, what type of information are you giving to them right up front?
Well, first, I try and reestablish as much power and control as I am able to do. In other words, I let them know right away, you lead this conversation with me. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions and talking about a lot of details. And if at any point you're just like, I cannot have this conversation right now, I want you to tell me. I want you to cut me off. If there are things that you're angry and upset about, I want you to feel like you can come and tell me that and not feel like you have to shut up and take it, in other words. So I really want victims to know that when they're talking to me, I'm not just another suit. I'm not a supervisor. I can be a sounding board for them to sound off of. And for a lot of them, that's a good place to start with the power and control coming back to them. And then once we establish that form of communication, I let them know what they do have control over in terms of the criminal justice system. For example, according to the Victims' Rights Act, they have the right to be present at these hearings, but in most cases, they're not required to. So I tell them, you can come to this hearing and I will support you and be there the entire way. But if you tell me you can't do it, that is completely fine. That is your choice, and it is your right to make that choice. It's also important for them to know in terms of their rights of what they have, what they can't be left out of. So, for example, in the Victims' Rights Act, when a plea offer is made to the defendant in a violent crime, before it's officially extended, the victim has the right to be contacted and notified of what the plea offer is and to give their opinion on whether or not they think it's a fair offer. Now, unfortunately, victims, they don't have full deciding power in that. A victim can not like a plea deal, but the district attorney may feel that it's in the best interest of the case and go forward with it anyway. But the victim still has the right to hear it and to express their displeasure or happiness with said plea offer. And letting a victim know that, hey, this part of the process cannot legally go on without you is a big part of reestablishing that control to them.
And I think in talking about, during this episode, giving that information about what goes on with, the advocacy and the prosecution level is very different than what a lot of other advocates go through. But as we've all heard right now, it's all the same with regards to dealing with victims. We're trying to provide information, resources, referrals, advocacy. And I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces that we've done here today. It's just to talk about, how things really go in the system and how, as advocates, we advocate for victims at every level. And this is going to be a conclusion of our episode today. I'd like to thank Chelsea for being here with us today. And Intervention is a nonprofit organization based here in Colorado, providing court services to numerous judicial districts around the state. And we will be providing another podcast episode coming up. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Thanks so much.